Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, Takshashila Institution's Daily Public Policy Podcast. I'm your host for the day, Amit Kumar, researcher at the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies Program. And my guest for the day is Anushka, also a researcher at the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies Program. Her work focuses on PLA and India-Taiwan relations. Welcome, Anushka.
Thank you so much for having me, Amit.
And today we thought we'll talk something about that Anushka specializes on, that is China's military preparedness on India's borders, and more specifically, the PLA Western Theatre Command, something that has been a buzz and has garnered a lot of attention in the media, international media, and even in Indian media. And this is something which Indians, particularly the Indian Army and the foreign policy analysts, must specifically look out for. So, under Chinese President Xi Jinping since 2015, the Chinese military, specifically the PLA, has undergone massive reforms. And as part of these reforms, the PLA has, of course, focused intensively on preparing for combat under conditions of information age, integrating its services, arms, and systems into a joint network-centric fighting force. The PLA, Western Theatre Command in particular, has played a proactive role in working under the conditions of informatization and intelligentisation to secure China's southern and southwestern borders, prepare for conventional and non-conventional warfighting, and acclimatize its personnel to the rough terrains and harsh altitudes of Xinjiang and Tibet. At least those are the buzzwords that we hear a lot from the Chinese and in its publication PLA Daily, right? And so, from an Indian interest point of view, it becomes important, critically important, to assess these operational structure, training mandates, and warfighting priorities of the Western Theatre Command, with a special emphasis, of course, on understanding theatre's multi-domain integrated joint operations and efforts and capabilities. Of course, these are some technical words that I've thrown, but I'll rely on Anushka to explain these to our listeners and what all of these terminologies mean. So, Anushka, my first question to you is before we get into the Western Theatre Command in specific, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what intelligentization, informatization, and multi domain joint operations mean in the context of reforms of the PLA?
Right. Thank you so much for that, Amit. I think you've given the broad idea of what preparedness priorities in the PLA are looking like and what are the conditions under which they're kind of reforming themselves to fight. And you touched briefly upon the reforms of the Chinese PLA that started under Xi Jinping since 2015. And I just want to talk about what the priorities and the broad mandates have been. So these reforms have resulted in the creation what we know as theatre commands. And the goal of creating these theatre commands is to enable jointness and interoperability between, like you said, services, arms, and weapon systems. And the reforms have done other things like upgrade the former 2nd Artillery Corps into the PLA Rocket Force, which is responsible for managing China's nuclear arsenal. And all of this has increased the complexity and jointness of interoperability.
If I may just also get you to please elaborate on what jointness and interoperability means for our listeners.
Right. So, as the basic term suggests, jointness and interoperability basically refers to the ability of the three services that we conventionally understand the tri-services as air, navy, and ground forces. And in addition, in the Chinese context, the rocket force, which is the manager of China's nuclear arsenal. So jointness would mean that these four services should be able to work together in a singular operational direction or a principal domain under in both peacetime and wartime, without having to face the bureaucratism of having different operational commanders, different wartime mobilization and peacetime training commanders, and so on and so forth. And to add to the complexity of jointness, the Chinese have introduced something known as support arms. There are 4 support arms now since the former PLA Strategic Support Force has been disbanded into the cyber, military, aerospace, and information support forces. And the 4th arm that's existed since 2016 is the Joint Logistics Support Force. Now, in addition to the 4 services in the PLA interacting and interplaying war scenarios and preparing to fight together, we also see these support arms lending joint support to them. And so that would mean that the logistics support force would support a theater in which each of the ground, naval, and air forces would be present to kind of meet their logistical requirements based on prioritized budgets, so on and so forth. And the same is the case with cyber, military, aerospace, and information forces. So these become like the broad umbrella forces that support each of the theaters. And the basic goal to create theater commands was to circumvent the challenges posed by the former military region model, because one of the key challenges of the military region model was that MR commanders couldn't mobilize joint operations training programs or couldn't conduct war fighting mobilization, and ad hoc commanders had to be created in wartime. Now, in the context of theater commands, there is one single theater commander that has the ability to mobilize all of its ground, naval, and air forces in both peacetime and wartime. And so that's a little bit about jointness and interoperability between various services, arms,
Right.
and weapons. And just to quickly come to the question that you asked about what informatization, intelligentization, and multi-domain integrated joint operations means. So on informatized warfare, I think it becomes necessary here to understand that in doctrine, there are 3 pillars of military modernization. First is mechanization, the second is informatization, and the third is intelligentization. Mechanization refers to the induction of machines or weapon systems to augment the capabilities of soldiers and human personnel, right? Informatization, in the most simplest terms, refers to the integration of information and communication technologies into the machines to create a human machine interface. And intelligentization would mean, in the most, again, simplest terms, the integration of autonomous capabilities for machines and weapon systems so that human intervention becomes much less. So in a way, this kind of chain of modernization goes from high human intervention to the least possible human intervention. And informatization has been described by the PLA Daily, which is something that you alluded to in your introduction, as not just an additive or locally dispersed confrontation of various combat units or elements, but a comprehensive confrontation of systems against systems. And becomes very important to understand systems against systems warfare in the Chinese PLA's kind of reform doctrine, because what the Chinese argue is that when in war, it won't be an army fighting against an army or a navy fighting against a navy. It will be a system of various services, personnel, weapon systems, and support arms fighting against another system. And so they see the military force of a country as a whole, as a system. And this comes to be known as a whole of system warfare. And so they argue that the key linking factor that takes dispersed combat units and makes a whole system out of them is information, is network centricity. Hence, the need for informatized conditions of warfare, where the interplay of information across diverse combat units is at its fastest and highest, where there can be cyber and information advantages in warfare in addition to conventional warfighting advantages, and where information-based tactics of fighting and battlefield infiltration, such as electromagnetic warfare, can blur the lines between just ground, air, or naval combat. And intelligentization would mean kind of making this radical shift from just relying on battle networks to also relying on autonomous or intelligent systems that have the capability to make decisions in wartime, to engage in the kill chain independently, and also kind of adopt And in the Chinese conception, intelligentization doesn't just mean complete autonomy. It can also mean adapting to intelligent tactics of battle, which could be reducing dependence on firepower, using cyber methods in spaces where you don't need human intervention, favoring cognition centric warfare or under the threshold warfare to kind of subdue and wear out enemy forces, so on and so forth. And finally, just to quickly delve into multi-domain integrated joint operations. Again, for this, I'm going to rely on the definition that was presented by the Science of Military Strategy document published by the PLA Academy of Military Sciences in 2013. And it very lucidly explains the pillars of MDIJO. And this means that because the primary goal of the PLA is to become a force that can win local wars under conditions of informatization, there is a twofold requirement. The first is that the services and support arms of the PLA should fuse their operational expertise and platforms to the highest possible degree, which is preparing a joint operation force. And the second is to do so via a seamlessly linked up networked military information system. The former constitutes the material basis on which operational strengths are complementarized, and the latter constitutes the safe and reliable supporting link so that all operational elements have common awareness and a common battlefield posture. And together, when these two requirements are met, the force can be considered as one that has the capability to conduct multi-domain integrated joint operations.
Excellent. Just to recap and just to get this thing right, you talked about modernization having three pillars: mechanization, informatization, and intelligentization. When mechanization means introducing more machineries and equipment, informatization means adding information and integrate information systems, and obviously relying on people to get the most out of those machines. And then intelligentization means making those systems more autonomous and awarding a greater degree of autonomy, wherein they are not more reliant on humans and other sort of activities, right? That's brilliant. So let's come on to Western Theatre Command now, Anushka. Can you give a broad overview of how the Western Theatre Command works on jointness? What are some of the key pillars of its endeavors to achieve jointness?
Right. So, like you rightly pointed out in your introduction, the WTC does play quite a proactive role in trying to bring the PLA's vision for jointness into play. In fact, I'd say the earliest record of the Western Theatre Command studying a roadmap for jointness comes from a February 2016 meeting of over 100 officers from the theatre's political organs, troops, academies, and military branches. And this was just a few days after theatre commands were created. And if you look at the report from this meeting, it highlighted three key imperatives that underpin the Western Theatre Command's jointness efforts. First is that there is a need to refine border control and social stability in the autonomous regions of Xinjiang and Tibet. Second is the building of a small but refined joint operations command center. And the work of the Joint Operations Command Center is to be supplemented by other joint operations support and guarantee teams in areas such as surveillance, navigation, and comprehensive information services. And the third is to develop situational awareness capabilities for aerial superiority, given the benefits of air power in unfavorable terrains covered by the Western Theatre Command. And so we see these three basic kind of motivations for the development of jointness in the WTC. I would say these aren't it if we look at the trajectory of the WTC. While they talk about refinement of border control and social stability, I would also like to believe that by border control, they don't just mean stability in the autonomous regions within Xinjiang and Tibet and preventing illegal migration. I would say it also refers to power projection, engagement in military combat with neighboring countries, so on and so forth. So these also become motivations for the WTC to become a joint operations force. Um, and onto the factors or the methods which the WTC works with or deploys to achieve jointness, there are again three. The first is that they conduct combat training and preparedness exercises. Because China hasn't been in a war for many years, the only way for them to determine whether their forces are ready or not is to do real life simulations and do them on a regular basis to assess challenges. And this is a very famous Chinese model of the red team blue team exercises, right, which they kind of use to be able to assess what their difficulties and successes are. And so these exercises feature a range of scenarios and simulations that engage services, force capabilities, and weapon systems. And the goal across these exercises is to experiment joint operations among the services using latest technologies and weapon system, as well as older systems retrofitted with novel equipment, and all the while also assessing the officers' skill sets and talent. And for the purpose of conducting these joint training exercises, combined arms divisions also play a special role. And these combined arms divisions are most prominently found within the Xinjiang military district under the Western Theater Command. The second thing that the WTC has been doing to make itself an effective joint force is to get acquainted with the terrain. Because what is particularly special about the Western Theater Command's training is that it has to experiment with the harsh altitudes and terrains that it covers, because it's the largest theater command by area, and under it come both the arid northwestern deserts of Xinjiang and the high altitude areas of Tibet along the border with India. And so terrain training becomes a central pillar of the Western Theater Command's jointness capabilities. And thirdly and finally, there are two subparts that the WTC focuses on together. First is aerial superiority, and second is transportation training. Because air superiority is, of course, one of the motivations, as I previously highlighted, for the WTC to adapt to jointness, and because air superiority can give significant advantages in the rugged terrains and mountainous regions on the ground, it focuses on that in both its terrain training and combat preparedness work. And transportation training becomes important again because, like I said, it's the largest theater command by area, and personnel have to often move from one base to another. Sometimes the bases are on relatively lower altitudes, and sometimes they move towards higher altitudes. And so, in that regard, there have to be seamless logistical efficiencies achieved. It means you will have to coordinate with railway management systems, you'll have to coordinate with local authorities across provinces, so on and so forth. And so, I think these kind of become the methods to achieve the motivations of jointness in the WTC.
Quite interesting. And I have a bunch of questions on this. But first, to pick you up on something that you discussed, one of the things that you discussed was adaptation to harsh climates and training altitudes. Of course, this becomes important with respect to Western Theater Command, which spans through the Tibet and Xinjiang region. And of course, if our listeners would remember, when Doklam happened, and even later when the Ladakh face-off was happening, and India had sent a contingent of Tibetan troops, Tibetan origin troops in Indian army to scale the Kailash heights. There were a lot of reports and talks about how Tibetans are more suited to that region, and how it was not just a symbol, but also a fact that because they were more suited, India should employ these Tibetan origin people in troops in the mountain core, and etc. And how the Chinese themselves are not very adept at handling situation at a high altitude. And there were a bunch of stories around how Tibetans, because of the fact that they have lived there in the Tibetan plateaus for such a long period of time, their lung capacities are very different from a usual Han Chinese person. And the fact that they are not incorporated in the Chinese PLA, Han Chinese might not be as adept and effective in high terrain warfare. So just to pick you up on that, and you mentioned how these things constitute an important part of Western Theater Command's training. I'm just curious, how do they do that?
Right. Amit, I think you've highlighted a really interesting point about being acquainted with the terrain, and it's absolutely different when the personnel belong to that region, having lived there. But it's different in the context of the PLA, where the units aren't raised according to some of these regional contingents. In fact, they're broadly picked up from military academies, so on and so forth. And the process is the same as maybe in India. There is military academy, there is training, but those contingents can be from anywhere in the country, right? Can have demographics of people from anywhere in the country, and majority of them are Han Chinese. And so, in that regard, for the Western Theatre Command in specific, it becomes really tough to get acquainted and to practice. And prepare with the complex terrain and environment within the command's geographical area. And so, how do they do that? Terrain training can be achieved through both combat and non combat operations. So, some of the non combat tasks, and these are mostly what constitute terrain training, are some very basic things, right? But they become extremely important, and we're seeing them become part of the officer's skill training. So one of the examples is, for example, for a radar station that is based on a snow-covered plateau in Tibet or Xinjiang, its ability to maintain a continued tap water pipeline for itself, right? So in 2023, as late as February 2023, it was reported that personnel deployed at such a radar station of an Air Force brigade in the Western Theatre Command managed to connect their dormitories to a tap water pipeline. Otherwise, what would happen is that water from Tibetan glaciers or somewhere in the country would be transported to most of these places, and sometimes it would be stopped in its tracks for a bunch of reasons, right? And so just getting a regular supply of water has become an important part, non-combat task for officers and soldiers. The other thing is, and of course, they've adopted a bunch of solutions in this regard, including building large water tanks close to radar stations, allotting a detachment of water trucks, which every now and then replenishes the water tanks. And this is unless, of course, they were snowed in and they couldn't make it. And so, because this is so unsustainable, the efforts to build a tap water pipeline kind of talk about one of the successes of uh, maintaining a sustainable living environment. The other kind of very simplistic but important non combat task becomes shoveling snow in Tibetan mountains or in high altitude Xinjiang desert areas. It's a core non combat task, as the WTC has highlighted, because while the nature of the task itself is non combat, it has significant applications in combat work. So, for example, if we look at another report produced by CCTV in January 2023, it highlighted the significance of practicing shoveling snow in Xinjiang's Taching military region. And a border detachment was kind of practicing this, and what they had to do was they had to shovel snow which was as high as 2 or 2.5 meters and went for as far as 60 meters, because it was kind of hindering them from conducting their border patrols regularly. And these border patrols are absolutely eminent, because if we think from an Indian perspective, we do border patrols because it tells us if there is an enemy entrenchment, if what are our logistical requirements in case of war fighting, so on and so forth. And so it's the same thing projected on that side, right? And so this quote unquote snow ridge had to be rid of. And even though that report in particular made evident that soldiers took turns shoveling snow by hand, by now, which is within the last 1.5 2 years, we're also seeing images of both Tibet and Xinjiang military districts inducting advanced bulldozers, which are run by drivers of a company or the brigade that is in question. And this kind of tells us that they're taking the snow shoveling process very seriously, and it has become a military task. And in terms of combat operations that they undertake to kind of get acquainted with the terrain, these include practicing military work, or trying to do accurate live fire shooting in areas where there are gusty dust winds. And this especially happens a lot in the deserts of Xinjiang. And more often than not, it really hampers the ability of an artillery brigade to be able to be accurate in conducting live fire exercises. And so this kind of testing of the windproofing effect, the stability and calibration effects is done to kind of make shooting exercises a bit more complex, but at the same time also conducting skill training for those who will be handling some of these weapons. So yeah, I think that's basically a broad spectrum of examples that the WTC works with to acquaint to the terrain. But of course, there is a lot on this spectrum that they do.
Yeah, very interesting. Of course, one funny way to, I mean, if it were up to me, I would ask my troops to play a game of football, and I mean, starting from 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and then extend it and have the ambulance place just right next to it if they get exhausted and the exertion takes over. And anyway, all right. Of course, I mean, the other thing that I want to talk to you about was the one that you discussed in your earlier remarks was air superiority. And this matters, right? What are some of the new ways and weapons systems that Western Theater Command is working to incorporate to achieve that? Given that we know that relative to India, PLM may not have the aerial superiority. I mean, this is what some of the strategists have been saying over the past few years, and that when you compare India's air superiority and compare it with the Chinese in along the Himalayan border, China might be behind India on this front, and that is partly, I mean, majorly because of the reason that most of its aircrafts and machineries are directed towards its eastern front or the Pacific front, where it has South China Sea to manage, Eastern China Sea, cross trade, and even the US, right? So most of it equipment and resources are directed towards Eastern Front or the Pacific Front. But and therefore, in their calculations, in the Chinese calculation, the Western theater does not garner has historically not received that kind of an attention that the Eastern Front has received. So, given that, and the fact that some of the military strategists or national strategists in India argue that when it comes to air superiority, and of course the fact that in Tibetan plateaus that cover the entire range of Western Theater Command, they are on high altitude, and therefore there are challenges with respect to transportation, payloads, and other weaponries that the aircrafts can carry, or even the flight altitude at a flight that can altitude, and the weight with which they can take off, the grounding and the takeoff and landing becomes difficult given the terrain there, right? So how do you assess this, and what does the situation look like when it comes to air superiority between India and China along the India China LAC?
Right. Of course, that's a very interesting question, Amit. And although numbers on both sides aren't often clear, I mean, on even on the Indian and the on the Indian side, we know for a fact that when they talk about the troops that have been raised. And pitted against the Chinese PLA on the LSA, we hear various numbers, right? 35,000, 50,000, so on and so forth. But we can get a broad idea based on analytical research and Chinese media sources to understand what the Western Theater Command's posture is when it comes to aerial dominance along the LAC, right? First, let's look at or orders of battles, right? Or bats. And um, between 2020 and 2021, at least, Chinese jets to Indian fighter jets deployed in the Western Theater Command were at a 250 to 150 balance, which means that the Indian fighter jets were more in number, 100 more in number than the Chinese were, to be precise. And so, in this regard, naturally, the Chinese kind of fighter jet placement or aerial weapon systems that are in they're outnumbered by India, right? But China has taken measures to kind of fix it, even though yes, Eastern Theater Command remains an important kind of source of weapon system direction for them. And what are some of these kind of measures they've taken? They've try to work on air-based ground defense now, and for that they've deployed some 50 precision strike, ground attack and reconnaissance UAVs. India is also deploying UAVs at its own front. It's deployed some 4 or 5 Heron drones, 68 ground attack aircraft across the East and Central and Western air commands. And from the perspective of air-based ground defense, we have tough competition. Again, in terms of ground based air defense, on the Chinese side, there are 4 air defense brigades that are attached each to the Xinjiang and Tibet military districts, as well as to the Western Theater Command 76th and 77th Group armies. And at the same time, the Western Theater Command PLA Air Force has its own long range surface to air missile installations. Further, jointness again plays in the context of aerial dominance, where the Western Theater Command's allied armed and air forces are conjoining air defense systems. So, what they do is that air defense battalions that are affiliated with the Western Theater Command's army, they have now started to integrate into the chain of command of the Air Force bases and vice versa. And so the goal behind this move is for the PLA Air Force to lend its long range expertise to the more mechanized ground forces, and for the PLA ground forces to lend their expertise in handling low level targets to the Air Force. And so this cross service air defense integration in the Western Theater Command is something that's working out in their favor. But at the same time, India is investing in its indigenous VSHORADs and MANPADS systems to expand army air defense capabilities. Now, I want to be honest, I, for one, am not an expert on where these capabilities have gone and what they've led to in the Indian context, but we know for a fact that there is a match of capabilities, especially in terms of the thinking and the brainstorming process. What is it that India needs to combat a certain capability at the Chinese end? The other thing that I think the Chinese are really focusing on when it comes to air superiority is the ability to achieve successes in electromagnetic warfare. Because even if UAVs are such that their payloads aren't enough to do ground attack really well and decimate targets like tanks on the ground, what they can do is that they can in large swarms suppress the airfield as a whole and lead to breakdown of electronic systems on the ground and in the air. And this is something that China has experimented with a lot, because their UAV swarms have broken all world records. So some of their civilian companies like EHang have swarm drones in thousand hundreds, and these capabilities are of course by the virtue of civil military integration being adopted into the military sphere, with companies like China Electronics Technology Company or CETC working on drone swarming with the purpose of both offensive electromagnetic and defensive electromagnetic capabilities. And finally, if we look at, which was the final bit of your question, the new weapon system that they may be engaging in May 2021, when we were just recovered, we hadn't even recovered from the June 2020 Galwan Valley clashes, the Xinjiang military district acquired and inducted the PHL 11 122mm caliber self-propelled multiple rocket launcher system and HQ field air defense missile system, which again are excellent for long-range targeting. So yes, we're definitely seeing the Western Theater Command work on new ways to gain aerial dominance, especially with India as a target in mind. And of course, these systems have their own challenges given the harsh altitudes and terrains, and it remains to be seen what the successes are.
Right, really interesting. These do give us some clarity, sense of clarity on how the two armies of the Air Force match up and would match up in an event of and conflict going forward. Again, my last question to you, Anushka, would be, and this would be my final question, and we can end with this. Would be. Can you highlight some of the important things, just very briefly, that the Western Theater Command would be looking at going ahead? And what are the things that India should look out for? Very briefly.
Right. I would say the first would be UAVs, and not just in combat capabilities, but also in non-combat capabilities, such as non-combat operations, such as delivering logistics, armaments, and other support and relief material to troops that may be stranded in high altitude and harsh climate conditions. We've seen the use of these UAVs in supply drills in the Tibetan military district, and slowly they're bound to also extend to the Xinjiang military district. The other thing we're going to look at is the integration of information centricity in existing equipments and weapon systems. This is something I talked about at the very starting of this podcast. And so we are seeing light tanks like the Type 99A not only being inducted in the military districts, but also being integrated with information centered systems, so that these tanks can do their own damage assessment, they can do their own target calibration, and need little human support, so that they can become independent entities, and not a lot of complementary weapon systems have to be deployed to support these tanks. And finally, I'd say we're going to continue to see an effort towards modernization of officers' skill sets. So we're most likely going to see more advanced rucksacks that are provided to these officers, so that they have a continually heated thermos, they have night vision goggles, they have not so in that sense, not just a rucksack but an attire as a whole, where they have access to ventilation equipment, so on and so forth. And the whole goal is to make these more lighter, but at the same time more well-rounded, for a personnel to be able to survive comfortably in the harsh climates. So I think these are the things we'll see, and of course the focus on combat preparedness will continue. And these are things that India can not just learn from, but also work on combating them.
Right. Thank you so much, Anushka. Two broad key takeaways for me would be from this conversation is that China is thinking a lot about how to modernize its forces. And even despite the fact that it is an authoritarian country which likes to keep some of the informations close to itself, we see a lot of material that go out by the military and the party itself on how what approach does the military or the PLA needs to take going forward, and how to modernize it, and a lot of discussion that happens publicly between the party and at the party level and at the military level that we get to see. And surprisingly, that is not the case when it comes to Indian Army. And of course, they have the Chinese have taken taken it up a lot more seriously, and trying to catch up with the American forces, and the kind of modernization reforms that the Americans have themselves incorporated and are talking about. And therefore, I mean, to become a global force, this kind of discussion becomes important for them. And this is something which they're not shy of doing. And this concerns me to the extent that we don't see that much of a discussion on Indian Army and how Indian Army is thinking about modernization and other things. But and the second thing, that the condition that we have, I know this was somewhat technical, but I think indeed this was required, and this needs to be talked about a lot, and how China is responding to these modernization pressures, and how should India respond. With that, I'll take leave, and this is a fascinating podcast, Anushka. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. And if you like this podcast, do tune in to All Things Policy, Takshila's flagship daily public policy podcast. Thank you, Anushka.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.